The truck doors swing open with a metallic clang that echoed in Ingrid's chest. She squinted against the harsh September sunlight, shielding her eyes as the pale Indiana sky stretched endlessly above them. 3 German women stumbled onto the gravel, their bodies stiff from weeks of cramped transport. Dust coated their hair, and the lingering smell of mildew clung to their threadbare coats. Ingrid whispered to the others, barely audible over the creak of the truck's suspension. "Remember, tell them nothing. Expect nothing. They will break us slowly." The words weren't just caution, they were survival. She had seen the Soviets, the retreat through Poland, the chaos of Berlin. She knew the machinery of cruelty could wear a human down faster than any bomb. But what greeted them was something altogether unexpected. The barbed wire seemed almost decorative. The guard towers rose like skeletal fingers against the sky, yes, but the buildings were clean, orderly, almost welcoming. And there was a scent that made Ingrid's stomach tighten. Soap, real soap. Not the harsh chemical-smelling mixtures the transit camps provided, but something gentle, something warm, something almost impossible. Captain Mitchell stepped forward, her brown hair tucked neatly beneath her cap, a sharp but not unkind expression on her face. She gestured toward the cap, then smiled faintly. "Ladies," said Klaus Weber, the translator, "welcome. You are now under the protection of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Ingrid's jaw clenched. She had heard those words before in different languages. They were always the same, promises that could crumble the moment no one was watching. She braced herself for the familiar ritual of shouting, the rough hands that would pat her down, the casual intimidation that marked every new captivity. Instead, the captain extended her hand. Simple, patient, not a command, not an interrogation, just waiting. Gret's eyes widened. She pressed herself back against the truck's interior. Her heart raced. "It's a trick," Ingrid whispered internally. "It must be." Anna, 38, experienced beyond the age her face betrayed, followed silently. Her eyes held a flat emptiness, the kind forged in Stalingrad, in Soviet camps, in marches that had stripped her of hope long before arriving here. The women were led to a processing building. Beds with white sheets, towels neatly folded at each cot, washrooms with running hot water, ingredients of dignity they had been told no longer existed in a conquered world. Gret's knees nearly buckled. She sank to the edge of a cot, tears blurring her vision. "They're going to kill us," she whispered. "Nobody is this kind unless they want something worse." Ingrid shook her head, gripping her own hands. She had learned to navigate cruelty with caution, but even she felt the tiny pulse of hope rising unbidden. The next morning, boots crunched on gravel outside, voices sharp and commanding. The truck doors opened again. Ingrid braced herself. For the first time in 3 years, the world didn't erupt in fear. Instead, a young soldier offered professional courtesy. Another, a female officer, moved with calm efficiency. They were shown their quarters, medical care, work assignments, and even male privileges. Words of the Geneva Convention washed over Ingrid like a familiar poison, but the actions behind them spoke louder than regulations. Gret struggled to believe it. She had begun to imagine a world where dignity wasn't a fleeting luxury. Here it seemed almost tangible. Soap, towels, clean sheets, meals, simple acts that had been stripped away for years were returned. Yet trust was still a dangerous gamble. Ingrid held her son's photograph close, a reminder of the world she had left behind. She reminded herself constantly, do not trust, do not hope too much. They will test us. And in that moment, under the clear Indiana sky, 3 women began to learn a lesson no war had ever taught them. Sometimes mercy exists not as a weapon, but as a lifeline.
The morning air carried the faint scent of wet earth and soap as Ingrid stepped out of the barracks for the first time. Sunlight dappled the gravel paths, glinting off the fences that had once promised only confinement. Yet here, the barbed wire seemed more like a formality than a weapon. Garden plots lined the sides of the buildings, their late-season vegetables bending under the weight of September's harvest. Ingrid glanced at Anna and Gret. Anna's face was unreadable, the steel mask of a woman who had endured horrors too deep for words. Gret's wide eyes scanned the compound as if searching for the trap that she was certain had to exist. It can't be real," Gret whispered, clutching her threadbare coat. Ingrid's hand rested lightly on hers, not in reassurance, but as a shared acknowledgement of the impossibility before them. "It feels real," she admitted quietly. "But remember, hope is a weapon they can take from you faster than anything else." They were met by Captain Mitchell again, her posture precise and controlled, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of warmth. "We have assigned quarters for you," Klaus Weber translated. "Meals, medical care, and work assignments will be provided. You will also have access to mail and education programs." Ingrid surveyed the compound. Other women, presumably prisoners, walked freely along the paths. Some carried books, others engaged in quiet conversation. A small group tended a garden, their hands steady and purposeful. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the far side, although she knew they were only young volunteers from the local town, allowed occasional interaction under strict supervision. Still, it was a sound she had not heard in years, a hint of life continuing outside war and death. They were escorted to a washroom. Hot water ran freely, soap lathered easily in hands that had not touched it in months. The scent was intoxicating, lavender, clean linen, something that spoke of humanity rather than survival. Gret's knees buckled beneath her. She sank onto the tile floor, tears streaming down her dust-covered face. Anna simply washed her hands, methodically, her expression unreadable. The years of Stalingrad, forced marches, and Soviet camps had hardened her. Nothing shocked her now. But even she could not ignore the subtle difference. Here there was no immediate threat, no fear of rough hands, no yelling, no arbitrary punishment. Later, Ingrid was assigned to assist in the camp infirmary. Her hands, trained by years in field hospitals across Europe, remembered the rhythm of healing, the careful assessment of wounds, the pressure of a bandage applied just so, the reassurance in a quiet voice. Dr. Patterson, the camp's chief medical officer, watched her silently for several minutes before nodding with approval. "Excellent work," he said in broken German. Ingrid hesitated, unused to praise. Here, skills were valued for what they were, not for what they could be exploited to gain intelligence. It was a small relief, but one that threatened to unbalance the careful skepticism she had maintained since the fall of Berlin. Meanwhile, Gret struggled with her first English lesson. Tommy, a young guard with an earnest expression and steady patience, sat beside her, pointing to images in a children's book he had brought from town. "Farm," he said, slowly, tapping a drawing of a red barn. "Arum," Gret repeated, her tongue caught between unfamiliar syllables. "Your farm big?" Tommy asked, showing a photograph of his parents' modest farmhouse. Gret hesitated, a photograph of her own family tucked securely against her chest. Her hands shook. She glimpsed the faces of strangers and felt the instinctive fear that humans often reserved for the unknown. But even in her fear, curiosity stirred, a small, dangerous thing that threatened to weaken her wall of caution. "Big," she finally asked. Tommy smiled, his blue eyes soft. Not so big, but it's home. Someday I'll help my father with the harvest. The simple sentence struck her. Home. A concept she hadn't allowed herself to remember for years, buried under the rubble of war, death, and displacement. By the end of the day, Captain Mitchell had walked the compound twice, observing routines, checking on prisoners, noting how assignments and schedules were executed. She was acutely aware of the delicate balance she maintained, showing kindness while adhering to regulations, restoring dignity without undermining authority, cultivating trust without sacrificing security. It was a careful dance, and the slightest misstep could unravel weeks of progress. In the barracks that evening, the women settled into their bunks. Gret carefully tucked away the photograph of her family, still trembling from the day's experiences. Anna sat silently, as always, cataloging the mental inventory of the camp, patterns in guard routines, shifts in prisoner interactions, subtle changes in privilege. Ingrid wrote notes in her own small notebook, documenting procedures, treatments, and schedules, not for intelligence, but as a way to retain control over her fractured world. Outside, the compound lay quiet. A soft wind carried the scent of gardens and earth. The Americans had given them what they had not expected in years: order, cleanliness, even kindness. Yet, fear remained. It was a shadow that clung to them as they drifted into restless sleep, waiting for the inevitable. A test that trust, in the aftermath of war, was a fragile and dangerous thing.
The morning sun filtered weakly through the barracks windows, painting long, pale stripes across the wooden floors. Ingrid rose early, her body still stiff from weeks of cramped transport and restless sleep. Outside, the camp was coming to life. Women walked purposefully to assign duties. Guards moved quietly, but attentively. The faint hum of conversation threaded through the crisp September air. Ingrid lingered for a moment, taking stock. This was not like any prison she had known. There were no shouting orders, no hands striking women from minor infractions, no arbitrary punishments for imagined offenses. It was organized, civilized even, and yet the absence of fear was almost unbearable. Her body remained tense, muscles coiled for a threat that had never come. Greta, as usual, was slower to rise. She sat on the edge of her cot, her fingers brushing over the photograph she had hidden beneath her coat the day before. The faces of her parents and siblings stared back at her from the fragile paper, frozen in happier times. She allowed herself a tiny smile, then shook it off quickly. Hope is dangerous, she reminded herself. Anna, always silent, had already dressed. She moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that emotion could be fatal. Every step, every motion was controlled, deliberate. Even here, even in relative safety, she carried the weight of every war, every camp, every loss she had survived. Their first task that day was in the camp garden. Rows of late-season vegetables needed tending, and the American command had decided that the German women's knowledge of farming could be put to use. Ingrid knelt beside Anna, working to clear weeds from the soil. "Do you remember planting like this in Germany?" she asked softly, careful not to sound like a teacher or a superior. Anna's hands didn't stop moving. "Yes," she replied flatly, "but this is different." Ingrid didn't push further. She understood. The difference was profound. Here, they were allowed to work without fear of punishment. There was no immediate threat hanging over every action. It was freedom, subtle, measured, and frightening in its own way. Meanwhile, Greta struggled with her assigned task of cataloging supplies in the storage shed. Tommy, the young guard, hovered nearby, patient but attentive. "Need help?" he asked gently. Greta shook her head, cheeks flushing. I I can manage." "Are you sure?" he pressed, handing her a stack of neatly folded sheets. She hesitated, then nodded. "This is not a trick," she told herself. "They really are just kind." And yet, every instinct screamed caution. She worked quickly, double-checking each item, measuring each action as if some hidden danger might strike with a single misstep. By mid-afternoon, the women gathered for their first medical checkups. Ingrid assisted Dr. Patterson, her hands moving with practiced skill as he examined each patient. It was strange, she thought, to heal without fear, to tend to wounds knowing that no hand would strike her in return. "You're remarkable," Dr. Patterson said, quietly, almost reverently, as Ingrid sutured a small cut on one woman's hand. She flinched, startled by praise. They really mean it, she thought. And for the first time in years, a tiny seed of pride pushed against the hard shell she had built to survive. Lunch was served in the mess hall. The tables, once intimidating symbols of rigid hierarchy, now seemed almost ordinary. The women sat quietly, unsure how to behave. They had been trained to mistrust, to shrink, to defer, and yet there was no one shouting, no one enforcing obedience through fear. Greta tentatively reached for her tray, eyes darting around. Across the room, other women were eating, talking softly, laughing occasionally. A strange foreign sound, laughter without hysteria, without edge. Her chest tightened. Am I allowed to feel relief? After the meal, Greta lingered, hesitating near a window as Tommy approached. "Would you like to go to the library, just for a while?" he asked. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and together they walked towards the small building. Inside, shelves of books offered worlds she had thought lost forever. She traced her fingers along the spines, feeling the weight of history and knowledge, and for the first time from Berlin, allowed herself to imagine a future. Anna, meanwhile, retreated to the quiet of the barracks, cataloging damaged books for repair. Her meticulous attention to detail kept her mind occupied, a shield against hope she was not ready to embrace. Ingrid observed them both. The differences were stark. Greta, tentative but yearning for connection. Anna, armored and vigilant. And herself, a bridge between despair and cautious optimism. She realized that the camp was more than a place of temporary refuge. It was a test of the human spirit. Could trust, nurtured carefully, take root after years of war and betrayal? Evening fell with an eerie calm. The wind carried the faint sense of earth, soap, and cooking. In the barracks, the women settled onto their bunks. Greta studied her photograph once more. Anna remained silent, and Ingrid wrote in her notebook, documenting routines, observations, and the small victories of the day. For the first time in weeks, they were not merely surviving, they were living. And with living came the dangerous, fragile stirrings of hope. The morning light crept through the barracks windows, brushing softly over wooden floors that had already begun to feel like a fragile home. For the first time, Ingrid allowed herself to notice the little details, the neat rows of cots, the clean blankets, the soft hum of activity outside. There was an order here she had not expected, a rhythm to life that seemed almost impossible after years of chaos. Gret awoke to the sound of laughter. Tentatively, she peered from her bunk and saw a small group of women gathered near the wash-house, sharing a joke. Their laughter was light, cleansing almost, a stark contrast to the brittle, panicked giggles of camps past. For a moment, Gret's heart clenched. Is this allowed? She wondered. Will it last? Breakfast brought more small comforts, warm bread, fruit, and even coffee. Simple things that had once seemed mundane now felt luxurious. Ingrid noted the way the women handled their trays, careful yet hesitant, as if every act of normalcy carried a hidden cost. By mid-morning, they were allowed to resume work assignments. Ingrid returned to the infirmary, tending to small cuts and bruises, but now with a subtle freedom she had never known. There were no shouts, no rough hands, only Dr. Patterson's quiet supervision and the occasional nod of approval. Healing, she realized, was more than the mending of flesh. It was the restoration of dignity, confidence, and identity. Gret, encouraged by Tommy, spent the morning in the camp schoolroom. She practiced English aloud, stumbling over letters and syllables, but each small success brought a tentative smile. Tommy watched patiently, occasionally correcting her pronunciation, occasionally laughing at her mistakes. The laughter was gentle, never mocking, and Gret found herself wanting to repeat the words just to hear the sound in her own voice. "Your family?" Tommy asked gently one afternoon, pointing to the photograph she had shown him the day before. "Your mother, your father, what were they like?" Gret hesitated. The photograph pressed against her chest. Memories she had tried to bury surfaced. Her father kneading dough for the bakery, her mother's soft voice singing lullabies. Her chest tightened. She wanted to share, to connect, but fear held her back. "If I tell him, what will it cost me?" she wondered. Meanwhile, Anna began working in the library, cataloging damaged books and repairing torn pages. She moved with methodical precision, creating order from disorder. It was a quiet kind of rebellion against chaos, a way to assert control over a world that had stripped her of so much. Occasionally, she glanced at the windows, observing the gardens and the women moving about. Trust was not yet possible, but observation was safe, and it allowed her to navigate this new reality. Ingrid watched both women carefully. The contrasts were striking. Gret, cautious yet eager to reclaim fragments of life. Anna, reserved but resolute in protecting her inner world. Ingrid herself had begun to accept small freedoms, taking walks through the garden, exchanging brief words with other prisoners, noting patterns in daily routines. She realized that even small acts could be revolutionary. A kind word, a laugh shared, a wound tended without fear. As the days passed, bonds slowly formed. Small acts of kindness threaded through the camp. A woman sharing a loaf of bread, a guard bringing chocolate for those who excelled in English lessons, another tending the infirmary when Ingrid was occupied. Trust, fragile as it was, began to creep into the space between them, threading connections that had been severed by war. But not all interactions were simple. The presence of Colonel Harrison, though distant, loomed over the camp like a storm cloud. His rare visits brought tension. Guards became rigid, routines became more formal, and the women instinctively recoiled from authority. Captain Mitchell walked a delicate line, maintaining the experiment of dignified treatment while keeping security and military scrutiny in mind. One afternoon, Gret wandered into the garden, pulling weeds and listening to the rhythmic sound of the soil against her gloved hands. Tommy joined her, holding a small trowel, and they worked side by side in silence. For the first time, Gret allowed herself to speak freely, describing the bakery of her childhood, the smell of fresh bread, the laughter of family mornings. Tommy listened with genuine curiosity. "People everywhere. They're mostly the same. It's the leaders who make the trouble," he said finally. The statement struck Gret deeply. She had spent years believing that all Americans were potential enemies, every face hiding judgment or cruelty. Yet here he spoke simply, honestly. It was a lesson harder to learn than any in a classroom, that humans could be kind without expectation, merciful without hidden motives. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Indiana horizon, the barracks felt different. Women were talking quietly, exchanging scraps of news from home, discussing books they had read, sharing laughter that was no longer forced or fearful. Even Anna allowed herself a faint smile, a subtle acknowledgement of life continuing beyond survival. Ingrid wrote in her notebook once more, documenting the small victories, letters received from home, successful lessons in English, minor recoveries in the infirmary. Each note was a lifeline, a record of humanity returning. She understood that trust was tentative, fragile, and dangerous, but it was also essential. Hope, she realized, was a weapon far stronger than fear, if wielded carefully. And for the first time, the three women allowed themselves a private acknowledgement. Perhaps life, even in captivity, could contain moments of dignity, laughter, and renewal.
The calm of early October was deceptive. Camp Blackwater, with its orderly gardens and well-tended barracks, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of fragile security. But tension had begun to coil like a serpent beneath the surface, and no one felt it more acutely than Captain Mitchell. Colonel Harrison's visits, once rare, had become increasingly frequent. He arrived with a retinue of intelligence officers, their expressions cold and calculating. His sharp blue eyes swept over the compound with the precision of a predator assessing prey, and the women, sensing his gaze even from the far end of the garden, recoiled. "The Americans are watching us," Greta whispered to Ingrid one morning as they prepared the infirmary. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrubbed a basin clean, a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead. Ingrid did not answer immediately. She understood the silent language of surveillance, the way every glance, every conversation, every gesture could be recorded and judged. "We are under the microscope again," she thought, recalling the abrupt lockdown that had followed the missing documents incident. "Trust is so delicate here." Harrison called a meeting with Captain Mitchell in the administration building, and for hours their voices, though muffled through walls, carried the unmistakable tension of a dispute. Mitchell emerged later, her shoulders rigid, her face a mask of controlled concern. "They want results," she said quietly to Ingrid. "Information, anything useful. They don't care that these women are civilians. All they see are potential assets." Ingrid nodded, suppressing a surge of anger. And the moment fear returns, all this fragile hope could vanish. She glanced at Anna and Gret, busy at their respective tasks, and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier than any guard's rifle. The next day, a subtle change rippled through the camp. Guards became sharper, more formal, less willing to engage in casual conversation. Work assignments were scrutinized, privileges questioned. Even small freedoms, the right to tend gardens or attend English lessons, were monitored with renewed intensity. Anna noticed immediately. She catalogued the subtle shift, the stiffened posture of guards, the clipped language, and the wary glances toward the administration building. Trust, she realized, was conditional, and she would not give it lightly. Gret, on the other hand, felt the fear more personally. The laughter that had blossomed among the women began to falter, silenced by the invisible hand of authority. She clutched her family photograph tighter, as if anchoring herself to something real amid the uncertainty. Ingrid attempted to maintain normalcy, overseeing tasks in the infirmary and offering quiet guidance to the women. Yet even she felt the oppressive weight of scrutiny. Every action, every word was potentially observed, evaluated, and judged. The safe environment they had begun to inhabit was slipping like sand through fingers. One afternoon, Harrison personally inspected the camp's records. He leafed through medical logs, work rosters, and correspondence with an intensity that bordered on hostility. When he paused at Ingrid's notes, his expression darkened. "These are detailed," he said, "too detailed. You are documenting more than necessary. Are these women hiding something from us?" Captain Mitchell intervened gently. "These are procedural notes, Colonel, for the infirmary's operation and oversight, nothing beyond standard protocol." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Standard protocol? They are prisoners of war. Every detail could be intelligence. Do not underestimate them." The message was clear. Fear would return if trust faltered, and no amount of kindness would override military command. That evening, the women gathered quietly in the barracks. Gret hesitated at the threshold, glancing nervously toward the administration building. "They're watching," she murmured. "Everything we do, they see." Anna,
seated on her bunk, did not answer immediately. She catalogued the nuances in her mind, the increased patrols, the clipped commands, the subtle intimidation. Her response was calculated. "Then we act as if they aren't," she said finally. "We control what we can control, nothing more." Ingrid, seated beside them, nodded. "We continue as before, but carefully. Trust, hope, it's still ours, if we choose. But we must be wise about it." Small routines continued. The infirmary still operated, English lessons persisted, gardens were tended, but the shadow of Harrison's scrutiny hung over every action. They felt it, subtly, in the stiffness of guards, the quickened footsteps, and the cautious glances exchanged during meals. And yet, even amid this tightening atmosphere, the human spirit persisted. Gret still smiled when reading with Tommy. Anna continued her meticulous cataloging, finding solace in order. Ingrid moved among them, a steady presence, guiding, observing, and shielding where she could. The contrast between fear and fragile hope became a daily exercise in resilience. Trust could not be given freely. It had to be earned, maintained, and guarded. The women learned to navigate the delicate balance between compliance and autonomy, between despair and the glimmers of life they had begun to reclaim. Harrison's looming presence was a reminder. In war, even after the fighting ends, authority could wield fear with devastating efficiency. And yet, in small acts, a laugh shared in the barracks, a letter read from home, a wound tended with care, humanity persisted. Ingrid understood the lesson keenly. Mercy, kindness, and trust were not granted, they were defended, nurtured, and sometimes fought for quietly against forces determined to extinguish them.